The last video in this unit is going to look at how we can accurately measure energy production. Right? So we spent all this time talking about how we can understand anaerobic pathways and aerobic pathways and which is being used in carbs or fats. Well, how do we determine any of that? So what we're going to do is talk through the primarily ways. So there's two ways that we can measure energy production. The first is by direct calorimetry. This is essentially measuring heat production to determine metabolic rate. That way we can measure how many kilocalories are burned, because we know a calorie is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Right? So when you consume a food in the number of calories, what they've actually done is stick that in what's called a bomb calorimeter, exploded that piece of food, and actually obtained of how much the temperature increased in water in degrees Celsius, and that tells me how many calories that Big Mac ultimately cost you. For humans, of course, we don't stick them in a bomb calorimeter and blow them up. We can put them in a calorimeter, which we'll show you next, but it's an airtight chamber surrounded by a water jacket so that we can measure how much water, the change in temperature, and then heat from the person will ultimately increase that water jacket, allowing calculation. The other is the use of indirect calorimetry, which we actually have the ability to measure here on campus and will use in the lab. So if you're in there, we're going to be using indirect calorimetry to measure several things, including oxygen consumption. But ultimately, you hook yourself up to a mask, capture all of your breaths using the measurement of oxygen and carbon dioxide produced. We can create a ratio that lets us calculate metabolic rate and provides insight into the amount of carbs and fats being burned. So this is what a calorimeter chamber looks like. And as you can see, it is a very large, very expensive, very difficult to keep and maintain, and isn't something that is used very often. However, it is the gold standard. So people doing some of these things, all of the measurements have ultimately been verified against using this calorimeter chamber. Again, you can see it is this airtight wall that only allows air in and air out. We can then measure them, and then we have our water jacket, and so we can measure the tiny temperature changes. And so you can actually YouTube. There's some pretty interesting YouTube videos of people who are living a day or so in here, and they're seeing their entire energy expenditure for that day in order to be able to measure it exactly. So that's great if you have access to one of those, but what most people use is actually what's called a metabolic cart for the measurement of indirect calorimetry. Again, this is what we use. We have a system to where we can capture all of our breaths, so from our nose and our mouth, we're able to capture both oxygen and carbon dioxide production. What we do when we measure this is we assume that what's going on at the lungs is representative of what's going on at the muscle, right? So if you think about this during exercise, right, we're producing CO2 from the breakdown of each of those carbon molecules in glucose, getting 6 CO2 per glucose molecule, and we're also consuming oxygen at the end of the electron transport chain. And so we can measure that and assume that the air that we're breathing and expiring is representative of what's going on at the level of the skeletal muscle. So we can get a couple of measurements from that. The first is oxygen consumption. Oxygen consumption, often described as VO2, which is the volume of oxygen consumed. Right? This gives us a great direct or indirect marker of aerobic metabolism, because again, we can say the amount of oxygen being consumed is in theory directly related to the volume or the amount of calories of ATP that we're generating. And indeed, we can estimate that it's about 5 kcals per liter of O2 consumed is how much energy we produce per oxygen consumption. We relate it in two ways. One, we have absolute, which is in liters per minute, or what most exercise physiologists will use is mils per kg per minute, basing it on body size. One of the important things is that, of course, as we measure VO2, this is a great marker for exercise performance, right? So we know exercise training can improve VO2, and so one of the great benefits is that if you have a high VO2, that it's tightly linked with good athletic performance. The second thing is, if you have a poor VO2, that usually means you're in poor health. VO2 is one of the most important indicators of overall health and wellness of a person as well. And so that's one of the beauties of exercise as medicine, is that exercise helps increase VO2, which helps increase qualities of daily life. The other measurement that we can get from indirect calorimetry is what's known as the respiratory exchange ratio, often just called the RER. What this is using the ratio of oxygen used and CO2 produced during metabolism to calculate which is being used, either carbohydrates or fats. So if you wondered earlier on in this module how we figured out how much carb and how much was fat, this is how we did it. How RER works is it's a range from 0.7 to 1 is the values that you get when you divide CO2 divided by oxygen. These aren't made up numbers. In fact, these come from real math. If you'll look, I won't explain how all this exactly works, but we can get 6 oxygen plus glucose here gives us 6 CO2. Remember, we break down each carbon molecule in glucose, blow off 6 CO2, form 6 molecules of water, and ultimately make ATP. If we divide our CO2 divided by our oxygen, right, we have 6 oxygen divided by 6 gives us 1. So if you were using only carbohydrates and all carbohydrates, you would have an RER equal to 1. If we look on the other side, the RER for fats is using, ultimately we have the input of 23 oxygen to be put in and 16 CO2s, right, for a 16 carbon fatty acid. And so if we then divide that, we get a value that is equal to just slightly under 0.7. So if you are using only fatty acids as your primarily as your aerobic metabolism, then you would have an RER of 0.7. Ultimately, what we would indicate is that most people hover around roughly about 0.8, because if you'll remember from earlier in this module, we said about 66% or so of metabolism, aerobic metabolism at rest uses fat, right? So we hover closer to that. Indeed, if you pick the middle point is 0.85. This tells us 50% carb, 50% fat. Right? So if we think about this on the chart here from earlier, right? So here our RER is 0.85. As we move this way and we use more carbohydrate, we approach 1. If we move this way, our RER approaches 0.7, and so you're going to need to be able to do that for your exam. So if I said you went from running at 3 miles an hour to 4 miles an hour, would your RER increase or decrease? Right? If you increase intensity, then you would be getting closer to 1. Right? So this is, again, only valid for aerobic metabolism. Right? Fat doesn't go through anaerobic metabolism. It's only aerobic. So if you're doing a light or a really high intensity exercise or a short duration, the RER isn't going to help. And again, here's a good idea and how we talked about the specifics here. So this is from your book, again, looking at breaking those down and which way you would go. So RER of 0.85, about 50-50. 1 is 100% carbs, and 7.7 is there. And then again, this is the specific value. So I just gave the rounded value of 5, but we also talked about these specific numbers. So we get more calories per liter of oxygen from carbs than for fat, and it's why we use these at really high intense exercises. The last topic that I'm just going to briefly touch on that's in your book is the energy that we use at rest doing nothing. So first is, there's two definitions. The first is the basal metabolic rate. This is an extremely, extremely strict definition. It's the metabolic rate in the supine position exactly 12 to 18 hours after a meal, immediately after waking up in a thermoneutral environment, in one of those environmental calorimeter chambers, right? And so that one is only measured in the lab. We can also get resting metabolic rate. This is a much more flexible. It's the metabolic rate after a light meal, 30 to 60 minutes of resting quietly. You can get these from some indirect calorimetry measures as well as being in the chamber. This basal metabolic needs to really be in a chamber, but you can estimate them pretty good. As you might understand, there are several factors that are going to affect your basal or resting metabolic rate. One is age, sex, even body temperature, stress, and body surface. So what are the exact mechanisms? One is body mass, right? If you have more muscle, then you're going to be have a higher resting metabolic rate just because of its ATP usage. So with age, it goes down because we lose muscle mass. In sex, of course, males higher than females because we have more muscle mass. Body temperature, that relates to the rate at which the enzymes work. If you remember, higher temperature stimulates enzymes, which we talked about in the enzyme section and also in the EPOC section today. If you have stress, stress relates to the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. That increases metabolism as well. And then, of course, body surface area, which can affect temperature and a myriad of other things. So that finishes up for metabolism. I hope you enjoyed this section. This is, I think a lot of the true exercise physiology that a lot of people really want to learn about and one of my favorites to teach. So I hope you've enjoyed it.